we need to stop immigration.
Is Nigel Farage the future of the British right? And what is next for Jacob Rees-Mogg? To find out, I'm joined by the former Member of Parliament. Thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Do you agree with Nigel Farage that we may see some defections from current and perhaps even former members of Parliament to the Reform Party?
I don't know. It's not impossible, though I noticed that Suella Braverman, who was rumoured maybe thinking of this, has said that she's not going to. New parties often overtalk the number of defections that they're going to get, and after Lee Anderson went, there were rumours that quite a number of people were going to defect to Reform, and this never materialised. So I'd always be cautious about claims of defections.
And one assumes that, seeing as you're still a Conservative Party member, this isn't on the cards for you. Why haven't you chosen to defect? Isn't the Tory party now a sort of wet Liberal party?
No. Let me answer the question and then say what I think the Tory party is. You saw during the election campaign that Reform has not made the breakthrough as a mature political party. So it's got Nigel, who is a formidably able communicator, has very interesting ideas, many of which I agree with. It then had quite a number of Looney Tune candidates who were really very difficult, who had views that are certainly not my views, that were actually damaging to what Nigel was trying to do, and they had a manifesto that didn't add up. So Reform has a long way to go before it is a serious political party that can have both the people and the policies that make it ready for power of any kind. At the moment, it's got one big figure, and we're not an entirely presidential system. As for the Tory party has often been able to adapt to circumstance. Now, I think by the election, we were offering something that voters didn't want, but I didn't want much either, actually. We'd failed on immigration, we'd failed on taxation, and we were still supping on the thin gruel of greenery, which is making everybody cold and poor. And we hadn't used Brexit to maximum advantage to create a really efficient, competitive economy. Now, why was that? Why were we not pushing ahead with those ambitious, exciting opportunities? Partly because of the way politics had been going over many years, our link to the European Convention on Human Rights, the costs of the pandemic. So some things were historic and some things were dealing with problems that had arisen. But opposition is often a time to go back to your principles and reform policy. It's what Margaret Thatcher did between 75 and 79. It's what was done between 45 and 51 when we tried to work out how did a Conservative Party deal with a socialist Britain. 75 to 79, we dealt with how did a Conservative Party deal with a broken Britain. And I think we're in that sort of period again. How do you deal with a sluggish economy, low productivity, high taxation, an overblown state, and get it back to what the Conservative Party ought to be? And I think there's a real opportunity to do that from opposition.
Shouldn't you take responsibility as a former Member of Parliament and as a collective party for those failures you've mentioned? Record immigration, record taxation, record spending, net zero policies, rampant wokery across Whitehall. All of these things didn't just happen coincidentally or because of the European Convention of Human Rights or the European Union or some other person you're blaming. This is because Conservative MPs chose to pursue those centre-left to, frankly, radical left policies, particularly when it comes to immigration. Your party needs to take responsibility for that. You need to take responsibility for that. Reform has a few cranky candidates, but look at the Tory party legacy.
Part of what you say is absolutely right, and I think the Conservatives, and that includes me, have to recognise that people didn't vote for us because we'd got things wrong. They didn't go to Reform because Reform stole our votes. They went to Reform because we had let our voters down. Now, some of these things that you've referred to were directly our fault. So there was the idiotic decision, the very last thing Theresa May did, to set net zero for 2050. hardly any parliamentary debate, hardly considered. It was a mistake of its time because energy prices were very low and therefore it seemed not to be a high cost effect. That's changed. It's now clear that it's a high cost effect, so it's much more important to reverse it now than it was a huge mistake to do at the time. At the time it was a silly, tokenistic, lightweight, opportunistic thing to do to show that we were on the side of the environment, but it didn't seem enormously expensive. I mean, it's not quite true because Philip Hammond was warning of the costs, but the cost was nothing like as apparent as it is now post Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that's an important contextualization and a realization how things worse. Immigration, until we left the European Union, we had no control over immigration. Now you'll say to me we've had a few years since.
No, I would say, just very briefly, you had control over non-EU migration. You didn't have control over EU migration, just to clarify that.
That's sort of true, but we didn't have complete control over returns. We had the Dublin agreements which were ineffective, so if people got here, we couldn't send them back. We were obliged to be part of the European Convention on Human Rights, effectively, or the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which was EU law. So there were really severe limitations on what we could do until 2020. Now, that's when we make our big mistake. And the big mistake is a COVID-related mistake, that it is thought after COVID that the UK employment market is so fractured that we need mass migration. And so for 2 years, from 22 to 24, 21 to 23, I suppose, we have very, very high levels of migration. And we do then take the necessary steps to cut that back very sharply in the autumn of last year. Now, that hasn't fed through to figures yet, but it is about to actually, the new Labour government will have an advantage of declining immigration. Then on the Wokerian things, one of the other mistakes we made is we didn't change the Blairite settlement. So one of the last things that Blair did was the Equality Act, and the new coalition government implemented it, which was a terrible mistake, because when ministers complained that civil servants were making them do things, actually this was very often because that was the law. And what we didn't do is use Parliament to roll back the Blairite state. And that, I agree with you, was a mistake of the Conservative Party in government.
I want to talk a bit about Suella Braverman. You mentioned her earlier. She made a speech in DC recently criticising the Pride Progress flag as monstrous. And this led to a vast backlash from many Conservative members of Parliament, people in the House of Lords. Kemi Badenoch says she was having a public nervous breakdown. What do you make of this backlash to Suella's comments from members of your party?
I think it's very odd. I think people are entitled to have views about flags. I'm not an American. I don't stand up every morning and sing a song to the flag. I don't think flags are, in the grand scheme of things, that important. But to the extent they are, there are 4 flags that should be of interest to people. There's the Royal Standard, which of course the King raised at Nottingham at the beginning of the Civil War, and everyone, well, not enough people rallied to the Royal Standard. There's the Union Jack, there's the St George's flag, and there's the flag of Somerset. And beyond that, I cannot think why people should obsess about flags, nor why they want to fly random flags. I'm not an advocate of flying flags for every passing political opinion.
But do you agree that that Pride Progress flag should be taken down from government buildings?
I think government buildings should only fly the Royal Standard in the presence of the King, when he's physically in the building under the rules relating to the flying of the Royal Standard, the Union Jack, and not actually even the St George's flag. I think that can be waved at cricket matches, but isn't suitable for government buildings.
And do you think that Pride Progress flag is degenerate?
I don't have a view on any other particular flag. I don't care about these other flags. They're not my flag.
They're symbols of the LGBT movement.
Well, people can have
they impose it in their schools and so on.
People can have what symbols they want, but they're not important. What matters are the flags that relate to the nation. In terms of government buildings should not be virtue signalling. That's not what they're there for. They're symbols of the state. I actually preferred it when we flew flags on the flag flying days, on the red letter days, and on royal birthdays, and you flew the flag to indicate it was a special occasion. I think we've got a little bit too American on flag flying, actually.
Do you think the phrase white men should be used as a pejorative?
What a bizarre thing to do. Why should that be used as a pejorative? I can see no reason to do that.
Kemi Badenoch tweeted about David Tennant, a rich lefty white male celebrity so blinded by ideology he can't see the optics of attacking the only black woman in government by calling publicly for my existence to end. Do you think it was wrong for Kemi to use that phrase white male as a pejorative?
It's not a pejorative, it's a description.
She was using it, she was listing a series
but how does she describe herself?
As a black woman.
So she's not using it as a pejorative, she's using it as a comparison to herself.
She had a list of rich, lefty, presumably
rich
both
is,
of those
if you're a
things.
Conservative, rich is a compliment.
Lefty certainly
rich.
isn't. She was pointing out his hypocrisy, and she was listing things that she obviously thought were very bad things.
She was pointing out that he was different to her.
Why should that matter? Why does it matter that he's a white male?
It doesn't mean that this was all rich. But it doesn't mean these things were bad.
My question
she was just saying that...
Why does it matter that she's a black woman and he's a white male? Why does she even point that out?
You need to ask her why she used these terms. But she wasn't using it pejoratively, she's using it descriptively. For a Conservative to criticise somebody for being rich would be bizarre. How are we going to fund public services if we don't have people who have any money? Kemi's not a commie. She's Kemi, not commie.
I think in this instance, one could argue, she was using the liberal, woke, identity politics language of obsessing over race, and that's why I'm asking.
This dreadful little man, who is, I believe, a comedian of some sort, obscure, dreadful little man.
He's an actor, yeah.
Oh, is he? Well, was extremely unpleasant. And I think what he said about her was atrocious, that he did say she shouldn't exist. Now that is well beyond the fair remit of political criticism. And she was absolutely entitled to be quite fierce in response to him. And his behaviour is deeply shameful. If he were a Conservative who had said something like this about a socialist, he would be deplatformed. Now, I'm not in favour of deplatforming, but he would have been ceremonially like Mr. Banks in Mary Poppins. He'd have had his bowler hat punched through and his umbrella torn up for what he had to say.
So why bring his race into it? Why is that relevant in any way?
She was comparing it to her as a black woman, which
why is that relevant?
Well, it's just descriptive. It'd be like referring to you as bearded. That's not.
It just seems odd to me that I think she's sort of using that identity politics. I mean, I suspect she is, but maybe you disagree with that. Do you think that liberal Tory MPs who support transgenderism, BLM, wokeism, and so on should be kicked out of the party?
No, I'm not in favour of kicking people out of the party if they think they are conservative. I think if you believe somebody can wake up in the morning and think they're a different sex, you're not, in any proper sense, a Conservative. But if you wish to give the Conservative Party £50 a year or whatever it is, thank you very much. But you don't have Conservative views.
But these people have been members of Parliament for the Conservative Party.
I'm not in favour of rooting people out and having a sort of checklist of views. But people need to be comfortable in the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party is not a party that believes you can wake up in the morning and decide you're a different sex. Even if individuals have cranky views, and this is a cranky view.
But many members of your party in Parliament believe this.
One or two.
And do they belong in the party, is my question. You're basically saying they don't.
What I'm saying is that their views are not Conservative views, but I'm not in favour of expelling people because there is one view that they don't like. Well, what if they have every other Conservative view? What if they're absolutely staunch Brexiteers, if they're in favour of low taxation, if they believe the family is a thoroughly good thing, if they believe in the nuclear deterrent, if they think all this green stuff is a load of old hogwash? And I don't mean what's actually happening, but I mean the response to it. I'm quite happy to accept that the climate changes. If they take all those Conservative views, but then they think that actually they can identify as a carrier pigeon, they're entitled to one eccentric view.
Do you think more broadly that Conservative MPs are too left-wing?
No, not broadly. I think there are some Conservative MPs who have views that are perhaps more common on the left than on the right. I think the Cameron approach to candidates encouraged people who weren't of particularly conservative views and was not particularly sympathetic to people of conservative views, and that had an effect.
Do you think that Cameron and others focused far too much on diversity hiring MPs, or candidates to become MPs, for example, obsessing over lists for women rather than on who the best people were for the job?
I always think you should focus on the quality of the individual, and those individuals will have a great variety of accidents. But what matters, to get almost into transubstantiation, is the substance of the individual.
Was Enoch Powell right to warn about the dangers of mass migration to Britain?
Enoch Powell's speech, known as the Rivers of Blood speech, is a terrible speech. It is a really bad speech, and it made talking about immigration incredibly difficult for decades. It's a blot on his career of an uneradicable kind.
Why was the speech so bad in your view?
Because its tone was excessively angry. It said things that were of debatable accuracy.
Such as?
What was the evidence of the dog mess being put through people's letterboxes? It was absolutely intended to be incendiary. And I think, unfortunately, Enoch Powell achieved exactly the opposite of what he was aiming to do, and he meant that people felt they could not politely talk about immigration because of the quotes River of Blood speech.
He was quoting his constituents who are writing him letters, and I just want to quote from part of the speech. "Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, his Member of Parliament, that the country will not be worth living in for his children. I simply cannot, or I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else." What's wrong with the principle of that, where constituents are writing him letters about certain things, and he thinks he has to represent?
We need to go through the whole speech if we're going to do that. Let me get the whole speech up, because there are parts of it. I mean, the language is of its time, of course, but the references to one immigrant moves into the street and the street then becomes uninhabitable.
And he quoted another constituent. I'm going to agree with you here. He quoted another constituent saying that the white man or the black man will have the whip.
The whip hand.
I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that the points that you're right. Much of the speech was incendiary, and of course you're right. It caused a huge backlash. The question I'm really asking is, the overall point that he was making, warning about the dangers of mass migration, was he in principle correct about that?
I'm afraid I think the speech is so overstated, so hysterical in its tone, that he damaged the argument he was trying to make, so she finds excreta pushed through her letterbox. There's no evidence for that. There never has been. It was debated even at the time. Where she goes to the shops, she is followed by children, charming. You read this out.
Yes, he's using very incendiary language.
So neither of us are actually willing to read out.
Well, I'm happy to read it out. It says wide grinning pickaninnies. That's the language he used.
Now, come on. Even in 1968, referring to people in that way was deeply and gratuitously offensive. And that is why it was a terrible speech. And I think Conservatives do themselves no favours by saying, oh, he was a great prophet. He damaged the cause with a speech that used language that was deliberately incendiary.
Let's put Enoch Powell to one side.
Okay, that's fair enough.
And let's talk about what's happening today. Recently in Leeds, we sort of saw this rioting, people burning buses, A few years ago we saw in Leicester there were sort of race riots, ethnic riots between Hindus and Muslims. We've seen grooming gangs have a major, terrible impact on thousands of young girls across Britain. Do you accept that multiculturalism has failed?
I think there are enormous problems that mass migration has created in terms of our culture, and that mass migration has taken place at such a rate that integration has been impossible, and that this has had an effect on the very fabric of the nation, and that we need to stop immigration now. And I don't mean just get it down to 300,000 rather than best part of 1 million. We need to get it down to the tens of thousands. It needs to be a small number to allow time for integration and cultural acclimatization. That yes, we have created in this country areas where communities are, and we've seen this with the Palestinian riots, are carrying on with their culture rather than becoming part of the English or British culture. And I think that is very difficult.
We've just seen a period of record immigration over the last 20 years, ever since Blair really, including under the Conservative government. In fact, they ramped it up. Do you think it's now time to have a period of emigration?
Well, people are free
Of net emigration is what I mean.
I'm not advocating net emigration. I think that we need to maintain a steady population for all sorts of economic reasons, and I'm worried that if you start encouraging net emigration, you get into the dangerous territory of repatriation, which I would be very against.
What about deportation for illegal immigrants, for example?
Of course we should
you
deport.
accept that?
Of course we should deport illegal immigrants, and we should say that anyone who comes here illegally will never get a British passport. They will never have the right to settle here permanently, and if the country that they've come from becomes safe, at any point in the future they will be expected to go there, and that they will have no right for their children to get British citizenship either. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
But on the legal side of things, anyone who's come here legally, you don't think should leave or should be deported in any way? There should be no opportunity for that to happen?
Well, I think if you are here and you are not a British citizen and you commit a crime, you should be deported at the end of your sentence. Ideally, you should be deported to serve your sentence.
J.D. Vance, who is Trump's vice presidential pick or his nominee, made some controversial statements around the UK before he was selected as the VP. He said that, maybe it was a joke, I don't know, that the UK could become one of the first Islamist countries with nuclear weapons. Do you agree with that statement? It
was clearly a joke. You must watch it because everyone's laughing in the room. What is even funnier to my mind is quite how cross the left become, because they have no sense of humour, and so they get frightfully outraged that he said something deeply shocking. It was a joke.
So you're not offended by it?
No, of course I'm not. It was actually quite funny. And he was saying something, he was overstating a point to make a joke, which has an element of substance to it, in that there is and we've seen this with the marches in favour of Palestine. There is a very strong minority within the Muslim community that supports Islamism, and that is something we should be concerned about.
I want to ask about history. I've spoken to a couple other Conservative members of Parliament, senior Conservative MPs, Liz Truss, Wella Braverman. I've asked them both who are their favourite Tory Prime Ministers other than Thatcher and Churchill, because everyone always says Thatcher and Churchill. I suspect that you'll have quite a good answer, so what do you say?
Well, I wasn't going to say either of those, actually. I was probably going to say Pitt the Younger. Some people argue whether or not he was a Tory. I think you can say he's a Tory. But he saves the country from Napoleon, and he understands the evil of the French Revolution and manages to ensure that the United Kingdom, as it becomes during his period as Prime Minister, is able to fight and win the Napoleonic Wars. And this is fundamental, creates 100 years of peace in Europe. It is really important. His Prime Ministership is of great significance. If you then go on, Disraeli, because he understands the need for popular conservatism. He's the first popcon that he sees how Conservatives should both embrace the extension of the franchise and then appeal to the franchise, and he works out how to do that.
So you're a Disraeli man over Salisbury?
Oh, Salisbury deals with what Disraeli has created essentially, and carries on with some of the popular bits of Disraeli, the understanding of the Constitution and of empire and of liberty. But he's more a continuer than he is a creator.
But he's very much against the Second Reform Act, and he feels it's a great betrayal from Disraeli that they expanded the franchise.
He does, and Disraeli is very clever in getting the 67 Reform Bill through. Bear in mind he has a minority Conservative administration. He's dealing with Gladstone. He has a section who are deeply opposed to any reform, and he manages to
Betray them.
Win them over to support it, and gets a reform through that in the first election held under the new franchise, the Conservatives win.
Suella Braverman, in her speech to NatCon in DC, she was talking about the differences between liberalism and conservatism. She sees a very sort of stark contrast between those two philosophies. She says we should choose conservatism. I know that you've described yourself as a classical liberal in the past. What do you think about this sort of idea of the separation between liberalism and conservatism?
Well, the terms are used very differently between the United States and the UK. So liberalism in the US is basically accusing somebody of being a commie, and whereas in England there are Conservative prime ministers who you would consider to be liberals. You might consider Robert Peel, who I could have listed as being a liberal because he was economically liberal. He believed in liberal freedom and liberal free markets and free trade. So I think one has to be careful about terminology, but I'm with Margaret Thatcher, who once said the facts of life are conservative.
Do you think that Conservatives in the UK have obsessed far too much over economics, economic liberalism, and they've kind of ignored the social conservative aspect of what conservatism is?
Yes, absolutely. We have done nothing to support the family at all. Indeed, the state has been hostile to the family in recent years, and the family is the building block of the state. It is the best start in life for children, and that is marriage. There has been no benefit of marriage in the tax or benefit system in this country. Indeed, you've been worse off if you're married than if you're not. This cannot be right. It's part of the reason birth rate's so low. It's part of the reason there's so much family breakdown and all sorts of societal problems, because we've done nothing to support the family. And I think that is been very misguided.
Looking back at your time in Parliament, is there anything you think that you wish you talked about more? And I know that we're talking about social conservatism here. One of the issues really controversial is abortion. And I think you've been fairly kind of private about that. I don't know, maybe you haven't, you can disagree with that. But, what do you regret not talking about enough?
No, I think I've been more outspoken on the right to life than almost any other Conservative politician. Other than Fiona Bruce, who was absolutely marvellous in her period as an MP on this, not just on abortion, but on avoiding killing old people, which I'm very strongly against. I think defending those who are vulnerable is fundamentally important, and I mean the unborn child and the elderly who are unwell, and that a good society looks after its weakest members. It is deeply shocking that we have abortion to birth for a disabled baby. It's a really terrible thing that they will literally be pulled limb from limb out of the womb and destroyed when they could live. And the disability doesn't even have to be, no level of disability justifies it, but the disability doesn't even have to be serious. That is a terrible, terrible piece of law. And I think people knew what our law said, that they would not wish it to be that way.
Is this one issue, and particularly euthanasia and abortion as well, but sort of taken together, the right to life, that you're concerned about in terms of the Labour Party being in government and so on?
Well, it's already a great tragedy. 250,000 babies died last year before they had a chance to be born. And this is the thing about the argument. The argument on on abortion always says, well, it's the woman's right to choose. But this ignores the fact there are two lives, not just one. And the second life just gets completely ignored and destroyed. There are over 100,000 people alive in Northern Ireland today who would not be alive had Northern Ireland had the abortion laws that Great Britain had. This is extraordinary and tragic, actually, that life is destroyed in such an offhand manner.
The reason I said you're private, and you're right to correct me, I suppose, is because this issue is so difficult to talk about in politics. It seems that whenever you're kind of asked a question about it, not you personally, but anyone, it seems like the debate gets shut down if you're pro-life. Why do you think that is? Why is it such a controversial thing?
Most of the debates on the life issues were in Westminster Hall, that they weren't on the floor of the House. Nobody takes a notice of Westminster Hall. I mean, it's a talking shop. It's not. I spoke in Westminster Hall on these issues, but they never gain anyone's attention. I didn't really think Westminster Hall was a proper chamber. I preferred the real chamber, but these subjects hardly ever came there.
But why do you think more broadly in society, in the media and so on, abortion is such a tricky topic?
Well, all topics are, to a greater or lesser extent, sensitive. But abortion, I suppose, is a particularly sensitive topic because there are many hundreds of thousands, if 250,000 babies were aborted, there must be many hundreds of thousands of women who have had abortions. And that is inevitably a very personal issue for them that will weigh with them to some extent. And therefore you're talking about something that for some people is very personal and immediate.